I start with the ending because outcomes matter more than noise, and my outcome is this. The company posted a correction, the board logged my ethics notice, the settlement cleared, my model was licensed on paid terms with my name on the schedule, and 3 anchor clients moved under lawful agreements that recorded they contacted me first. My badge once clicked red in a glass atrium while interns sat in my chairs, but the record now shows no performance plan, no cause, and a retraction of the hallway rumor that tried to stain my years. I formed a small firm with clean insurance, taught my team 4 steady steps, and filed the first big RFP with the even breath I used long before any title. I did not chase revenge, I followed procedure, I preserved mailboxes. I wrote dates and names. I sent notices instead of opinions, and I let contracts, key person clauses, and calm letters do what raised voices cannot. The humiliation was public and quick, but the return of my name was quiet and written one exhibit at a time, and that is the path I will describe. How I walked out with a cardboard box and came home with a legal pad. How the phones rang without me asking. How a board meeting changed tone when churn columns met daylight. And how dignity ends up where it belongs when a person refuses to perform and chooses to document. I remember the stand-up because humiliation likes a crowd, and he waited for the slide that said costs to say I was a burden and to signal HR to cut my badge, so I kept my mouth closed, watched the red light blink on the gate when I tried to leave for the bathroom, and understood the shape of the day. I packed my framed letters and the plant my daughter once set on my desk, walked past the founder's old memo about selling to the person, and let security do their job without making theirs harder. Then outside, I used the hood of my truck as a desk and wrote the only things that matter when a story begins to bend. Time, words used, who stood where, who clapped, who looked down, and that I was told to leave with no warning and no plan in my file. At home, I put the box on the kitchen table and built 3 columns on a legal pad. Contracts that name me, renewals inside 90 days, and people who will call me tonight because their work depends on a person who shows up at 4 in the morning when a pour runs late. And while I wrote, the first calls arrived, first Patricia, then Harold, then a chain of foremen who do not waste breath. And I said in each case that I could not advise yet, that I would send a general status when counsel confirmed what I could say, and I logged that they contacted me first. I opened the cabinet where I keep originals and pulled MSAs with key person clauses and handwritten addenda with my initials in the margins, and I tabbed the pages that tie rate cards to my oversight. Then I printed a calm template for a change of status note that does not solicit, only states that I moved into a consulting role and lists a forwarding address for lawful contact. And I left it in drafts because patience is a tool. Jennifer texted after hours that he had posted about fresh perspectives and that interns now covered legacy accounts. And I wrote her words as a note to preserve notebooks and calendars until counsel spoke. Then I closed the phone and checked my memory against what the badge log would show, since digital traces tell the same story without heat. I slept in short pieces and woke early to collect laptop serial numbers and email subjects I would ask them to retain under a hold. And I drafted a preservation letter that named mailboxes, CRM objects, and chat channels. And I added a line that any use of my name to reassure clients must be kept as well, because reputation is an asset even when a badge is not. Before 9, I bought a domain for a small firm and queued an insurance application for errors and omissions. Not because I wanted to run tomorrow, but because timelines move fast when panic holds the other side, and I prefer to move with paper rather than noise. By noon, an intern blast hit a foreman with a cheerful opener and a calendar link, and he forwarded it as an example of what happens when a script tries to replace a person. And I filed it under exhibits and reminded myself that the loudest answer is the one a court can read without guessing. Then I poured coffee, opened a new pad, and wrote the next 3 lines for my day: counsel, hold, status. Renee read the packet in a quiet room that smelled like paper and coffee, and she moved through the pages with a steady pen. And I understood from her calm that my case would ride on sequence, not anger. So we built the ladder the way you build. Scaffolding you expect to stand. First, the preservation notice with mailboxes and CRM objects and chat spaces named by field. Then a request to retain any message that used my name to calm buyers after the walkout. then a short memorandum that recorded there was no performance plan and no cause in my file, and finally a clean analysis of my non-compete and non-solicit with lines I could follow without guesswork. She told me that a general status note was lawful if it named no one and asked for nothing. So I wrote a plain announcement that said I had formed a consulting firm to advise on purchasing risk and that my new address sat below, and I left it in drafts until the hold receipts arrived, because I prefer patience to drama. The interns pushed a cheerful introduction to a platinum account with a bronze tier menu, and the buyer forwarded it to me as a warning that a mistake was in motion. And I logged the message as inbound and replied with a single line that I could not advise. Then I opened a new document and wrote a market brief that anyone could use. A sober list of bottlenecks, city inspector lead times, and delivery cushions that keep night crews from waiting on steel. And I posted it under my own letterhead to a broad list that included many outside my circle so no one could say I had cherry-picked a book. And the responses came fast and careful, with buyers saying they would review internally and ask legal questions if needed, and I saved each note with, "It's header because headers end arguments." Omar called from a quiet corner to say someone had normalized the churn column by slipping lost deals into a different bucket, and I thanked him for the detail and wrote the table name, the user stamp, and the hour. Then I asked Renee to send a board ethics notice with exhibits and a simple request for retention. And within a day, a meeting invite landed with board addresses in the line, and I felt the tone of the week shift from rumor to record. Noah posted an internal message that said I had abandoned clients, and I captured it from a forwarded screen and placed it under a tab labeled defamation. Then I signed the first insurance binder for my firm, registered the domain, and saved the certificate like an old habit, since certificates carry more weight than opinions. At home, I updated my 3 lines for the next day. File whistleblower under state statute with the context of the column move. Publish the lawful status note after the hold receipts, and prepare a license deck for the pricing model built on my own machine. And I breathed easier because those lines felt like bricks rather than smoke. By evening, a foreman texted that the interns had missed a bid window because they did not know which inspector handles Friday night pours. And I stayed quiet and wrote the timestamp and the name so I could step through it later without heat. Then I closed the notebook and set it by the plant from my desk, because both the plant and the pad remind me that steady care beats loud gestures. I filed the whistleblower notice the next morning with dates, tables, and the exact path where churn had been moved. Then I sent Renee a neat packet that paired screenshots with a short sworn line about retaliation risk, and by noon the board assistant confirmed a special call with outside counsel on it, which told me the noise had turned into work. Once the preservation receipts from HR and IT arrived, I published my general status note with 1 sentence about my new advisory firm and a forwarding address, and I logged every reply by header and wrote in the margin that no one was asked for anything, since discipline on paper saves a person when rooms get loud. Key person clauses started waking up on their own as procurement teams reviewed renewal calendars and saw my name printed on old addenda, and requests for continuity affidavits came in stacks that I signed with a steady hand, always adding the same 3 statements. That contact had been initiated by the buyer, that my scope would remain advisory, and that no company data had moved, and I saved each signed page with a hash so the file would travel clean. Noah tried to bury the ethics issue under a pastel post about digitization and growth, but the board call asked for the churn columns and the stand-up escort log, and when the invite for arbitration landed later that week, I felt relief, not fear, because rooms with transcripts are rooms I can trust. In the middle of that week, I walked into a chamber lunch and sat through a smooth deck where Alec and the intern sold a modern structure that ignored the way job sites feel at 4 in the morning. And I watched a stock photo betray them when a rival's forklift sat in the frame. And I took notes without malice. Then 2 buyers told me in the parking lot that non-renewals had already been sent, and I wrote that they informed me and that I gave no directions, because facts like that age well. At night, I finalized the license deck for my pricing model, with a simple offer: pay a fair fee or stop using derivatives, and Renee sent it with our independent creation proof, local repository logs, and a short-term sheet that favored compliance over drama. And their first reply was heat, and their second was curiosity while I stayed on the same line, Choose a lawful lane and label it. Omar preserved audit trails for the churn table and CRM edits and sent the paths and user stamps through counsel like a careful courier. And Jennifer wrote a neutral memo about the stand-up, the escort, and the absence of a performance plan in my file. And that memo read like cold water because it carried only times and names, and the note that interns were placed in my seats before my badge turned red. I checked my own steps against my rules and found no stray words, no soft solicit, no push that would blur clean edges. So I printed a fresh copy of my status note and filed it with the board acknowledgement and the arbitration calendar block. Then I set the next 3 lines for morning. Prepare testimony that reads like a timeline. Assemble exhibits for the model license, and draft a training proposal that forces on-site handoffs when a key person is removed, because the answer to a bad act is a better procedure that outlives it. Arbitration day felt like a long hallway with a clock at the end, so I carried my timeline, my exhibits, and my breath, and I let the record walk first. No performance, only sequence. The arbitrator read and asked for the stand-up calendar, the badge, log, the absence of any performance plan, the intern email that predated my exit, and the churn tables with the moved losses, and I watched the room settle because paper drains the theater out of people. Renee spoke in tight steps. She described how key person clauses tied service levels to my oversight, how procurement had contacted me first, how my announcement avoided names and asks, and how my pricing model lived on my own machine with repositories and timestamps that matched my sworn statement. And she set the license deck on the table like a level. Pay a fair fee or stop pretending spreadsheets can learn by themselves. Their counsel tried the modernization story, and the arbitrator asked a single quiet question about why churn. Needed new columns after my badge went red, then called a break, and when we returned, the posture had changed. They suggested talks, and we accepted because outcomes beat speeches. We asked for a written retraction of the phrase for cause, a cease, and correct for the abandonment line, a paid license for my model with a simple schedule, a policy that forbids removing a named person without an on-site handoff, and mutual non-disparagement so no one could turn next quarter into a show. And I added a small clause that barred the use of my name in emails to calm buyers. And they added a check and a confidentiality paragraph, and we initialed the term sheet while the coffee cooled. I walked out with no gloat, only a note to confirm the ACH, the retraction post, the policy page, and the license countersign, and I filed the term sheet behind the board acknowledgement and the whistleblower receipt, because endings sit better when they are nested. Within a week, the correction appeared on their site. The platform where interns had joked went quiet. The first license payment cleared with a neat code, and the new policy page showed a handoff requirement with a signature line for the client, and I saved all of it with hashes and dates. Key person clauses kept waking up without me pushing, and procurement sent continuity forms that I signed the same way every time, with the statement that contact came to me first, that my scope stayed advisory, and that no company data moved, and I saved each page because repetition builds a wall higher than argument. Jennifer resigned and cited misaligned values, then joined my firm with a clean letter and a small raise I had wanted to give her for years. And we wrote an SOP for non-solicited compliance that forced us to log who called, when, and what was said, and that log felt like a seatbelt instead of a leash. I bought a used table for a small conference room and printed the first version of Calm Sales Under Bright Lights with a 4-step card that we taped to every monitor: de-escalate, diagnose, document, deliver. And the team accepted it because it reads like instructions, not slogans. A trade group asked me to teach a session on client continuity. I accepted, and I added a slide that placed the founder's old memo about selling to the person beside the new handoff policy, because culture only changes when old words meet new rules. I ended that week by writing 3 lines for the next morning. Verify retraction, distribution, send the first license invoice reminder on schedule, finalize our advisory carve-outs on the new MSAs, and then I set the pen down and let the room breathe, since dignity grows best when the work is finished and filed. I kept the tempo measured because measured steps keep a man honest, so I verified the retraction distribution with screenshots from the site, emails to major accounts, and a PDF archived with a hash. Then I sent the first license invoice reminder on schedule with the reference number from the term sheet, and saved their quick confirmation like a receipt for peace of mind. And I met Jennifer in our small room to finish advisory carve-outs on new MSAs, so every paragraph said clearly that buyers had contacted us first and that procurement would remain on their side of the wall. The quarter turned, and 3 anchor clients filed new agreements that wrote my role as advisory with named deliverables and a clean firewall. And I logged each signature, with time, location, and a note about who initiated, because details keep stories square. Noah posted a pastel farewell line about wishing me well, and I printed it only so it could sit beside the earlier correction like bookends. And Alec left for a consultancy that sells slides to people who still think slides can run a night pour, and I filed the update without comment. I used the calm to finish the first training session for my own small cohort, and I watched 2 interns who had been told they were replacements learn faster once the room treated them like contributors, and I taught them how to read an inspector calendar, how to build a pre-bid map that includes real names, and how to write a post-visit memo that reads like a timeline, not a pitch, and they absorbed it because the method asks them to serve rather than perform. Omar sent me a final export of the churn table with the corrected labels, and I placed it behind the board, minutes, and the settlement. Not as a wound, but as a lesson, and I drafted a short article for a trade bulletin about continuity under change that used neutral examples and ended with the 4 steps and a checklist for handoffs, and the editor thanked me for tools and not drama, which is the only thanks I care to keep. The next chamber lunch felt different because the room knew the policy had changed, and buyers now asked for handoff plans before they signed, and I sipped water and watched a superintendent ask a vendor to walk him through the plan for the first week after a key person exits, and the vendor stumbled and then recovered with a real schedule. And I wrote in my small book that culture had moved a notch in the right direction. On a quiet morning, I drove to a job site at dawn and stood on the slab with Harold while he checked lines, and he told me without flourish that he had slept easier knowing paperwork now forced the right conversations before a badge clicks red. And I took that line home and wrote it at the top of my corkboard because a single sentence of calm sleep beats any headline. I kept sending license invoices on time and confirming receipts, and I tracked the policy memos training rosters each month until every regional team had signed. And I added a recurring task to check the page quarterly so the reform would not fade. A hospital system asked for a calm sales workshop, and I delivered it with the same voice I use at my kitchen table. Slow, simple, and stubborn about sequence. And afterward, a manager said her team now writes times and names instead of adjectives, and that simple shift cooled a tricky week, and I filed her note under outcomes because results deserve a folder. At home, I tightened the habit that steadies me. 3 lines on, the pad every night, and they were usually plain. Confirm client affidavit language, review 1 intern memo, send 1 thank you. And I kept that last one because thanks feels like oil in a machine, unseen but necessary. I ended the month by placing a small frame on the office wall with my own rule in simple text. No rush, no heat, only record. And I looked at it before locking the door, not to admire the journey, but to remind myself that a name stays right-sized when the work stays boring and correct. I kept moving the center of my work toward quiet stability because stability is the best answer to a public slight. So I wrote a short internal ritual for Mondays that asked 3 things of us. Review active holds and license schedules, confirm that any new inquiry came to us first, and write 1 page that reads like a timeline, not a pitch. And I watched the room relax because rituals remove guesswork. A regional buyer sent a note that their former rep had tried to calm them by using my name, and I forwarded the message to counsel and filed a brief reminder to the other side about the clause that bars that tactic, and the reply arrived with a clean acknowledgement and a promise to remind staff, which I printed and tucked beside the settlement so the edge stayed dull. My 2 interns shadowed Jennifer through renewal season and learned why dates beat adjectives, and I had them build a grid that recorded contact origin, scope, and firewall notes, and the grid turned into a dashboard that showed our risk at a glance, and I liked it because it respected reality. A small manufacturer asked me to audit their handoff plan for a senior engineer who planned to retire, and I walked their floor with him and wrote a careful week by week, including names, on-site time, and a list of calls that had to be placed before any badge changed color, and the plan felt like a gentle bridge that would not wobble when people stepped on it. The second license installment landed with the right memo line, and I filed the confirmation and sent a polite receipt. And I found it easy to be polite now that the facts had settled, and politeness became a habit again. The chamber asked me to sit on a panel about modernization, and I accepted with one condition, that the talk include the cost of missing human handoffs. And the moderator agreed, and I told a short story about a city inspector who likes to be called the night before a pour. And the room nodded because they know inspectors run on courtesy more than slides. Noah stayed off my radar, and I let him. And when a rumor surfaced online in the form of an old still, the platform took it down with an automated reference to the retraction, and I printed the notice and slid it in behind the first one and felt nothing except the steady weight of systems doing their job. I closed 2 advisory MSAs that wrote the 4D card into the kickoffs, and that small detail pleased me because it meant the method lived on the first page instead of the last. And buyers later wrote that they felt calmer having a card to point to when tempers rose. I set aside an afternoon to work on the handbook and added a chapter on graceful exits that described how to thank a departing person, in writing while making sure the work continues under light and names. And I sent the draft to the editor at the Trade Bulletin, who answered with a quiet yes and a publish date. And I filed the date as if it were an invoice because deadlines keep me honest. On a Friday, I walked past the corkboard in my kitchen and saw the top line I wrote months ago about setting 3 lines each night, and I realized I had not missed a day since the walkout. So I wrote 3 more. Confirm next training roster, review a junior memo for precision, and send 1 note of thanks to a foreman who saved a pour by making a simple call the night before. Then I turned off the light and felt that even weight in my chest that replaces the shake once a man decides to let paper speak, and to keep showing up early, to keep breathing slow, and to keep his name the right size. I kept building small proofs because small proofs make big claims unnecessary. So I drafted a 1-page continuity pledge that every new client signed at kickoff. A simple promise that we would log who contacted whom, keep advisory firewalls intact, and record handoffs in writing with on-site overlap. And buyers liked it because paperwork that prevents panic is worth more than a glossy deck. My interns turned their grid into a weekly brief that flagged risk before it grew teeth. And I watched them call a superintendent 2 days early to confirm an inspector's habit and then write a 3-line memo that cooled a potential miss. And I felt the good pride that comes when you see a habit take root in another hand. I reviewed our license, schedule against the term sheet, sent the 3rd invoice on time, and saved the cleared payment with a hash and a calm note. Then checked the training roster from the other side and marked the last region complete on the handoff policy. And I printed a clean list of signatures because reforms are only real when the last box is signed. A small rumor tried to stir itself at a breakfast table where someone hinted that I had poached accounts, and I answered by saying nothing at the table and later, sending the moderator our continuity affidavits that record buyer initiated contact in simple language. And he replied with a thank you for clarity, and the room moved on. A young manager asked me for a script to use when their own leadership wants to cut a senior face too fast, and I gave him a timeline template that forces them to plan the overlap and get client signatures before any badge changes color, and he used it to slow a hasty move by 2 weeks, which was long enough to keep a major renewal steady. I visited Omar in the server room and thanked him for the courage to keep logs when pressure rose, and he said he did it because he wanted to sleep. And I understood that sleep sits at the end of most of my plans, since systems that respect truth let people rest. Jennifer proposed a small audit service for handoff plans as a product, and we priced it fairly and ran a pilot with 3 firms, and the pilots ended with fewer escalations and cleaner renewal notes, and we kept the numbers simple because numbers make converts better than speeches. A quiet message came from a board member who said the policy change had already saved them from a loud mistake in another division, and I filed the note without ceremony since quiet is the correct tone for a lesson learned. I took a late call from a foreman who said a new rep had used the 4D card to cool a tense delivery window argument, and that the rep had then sent a short report with times and names instead of feelings, and I placed that report on our wall as a model for the next class. The founder's old memo about selling to the person still hangs in the old atrium, and I no longer feel a twist when I think of it, because my office has its own frame now with my rule in plain text, no rush, no heat, only record, and it guides me better than any plaque. I ended the week with 3 lines like always. Cross-check license calendar against bank confirmations. Audit 2 handoff plans for on-site overlap and signatures. And write 1 thank you to a junior who caught a risk before it grew. Then I turned off the light and let the house go quiet. And the quiet felt earned. The kind that comes when dignity stops needing defense and starts doing its work in the background. While I keep showing up early and finishing what I start, I kept translating the lesson into systems because systems outlast moods. So I built a simple ledger that tied every major action to a document and a date. License payments mapped to the term sheet. Training rosters mapped to the policy page. Continuity affidavits mapped to key person clauses. And I reviewed the ledger on Fridays until the columns felt like rails. A regulator's office sent a brief acknowledgement that my whistleblower filing had been recorded and that the matter was closed, with remediation. And I filed the note behind the board minutes and moved on because acknowledgements matter, but dwelling does not. Jennifer and I refined the handoff audit into a kit that any client could run without us. A checklist, a short script, for on-site overlap, and a 1-page sign-off for both sides. And we priced the kit low on purpose because broad adoption beats a high margin when the goal is calmer rooms. I visited a city site at dawn with Harold and watched a new project manager review the 4D card with the supplier before a delivery dispute could heat up. And I wrote down the time because preventive moments deserve the same respect as dramatic ones. And later that week, an email arrived from a superintendent who said his crew now speaks in times and names instead of adjectives, and I put that sentence on the corkboard. The third quarter license check cleared on schedule, and I reconciled it against the bank line in the ledger and felt the small satisfaction that comes when funds move exactly the way a page predicted. Then I closed the bank tab and returned to a junior's draft memo, trimming adjectives until the report read like a clean path. A chamber breakfast tried to turn modernization into a fight between experience and youth, and I answered a hallway prompt with a 2-minute walkthrough of our handoff kit and how it keeps interns from being set up to fail. And the person who had wanted a louder answer nodded because even people who enjoy noise prefer plans when they face a job site. Omar sent a final archive index for the churn tables with user stamps and checksums, and I placed it behind the settlement like a footnote that ends a chapter. And I sent him a quiet thank you because people who preserve truth deserve to sleep. One rumor bubbled up on a small forum and vanished under the platform's retraction reference, and I printed the notice and slid it into the stack without feeling a surge. Since systems doing their job is the point, I trained a fresh pair of interns to run a mock renewal from first contact to signed addendum with a firewall in place. And they finished by writing a 3-line debrief with time, origin, and next step. And I saw in their calm that the method had become culture. I added a clause to our own employee handbook that promised no badge would change color without a documented client-signed handoff plan and on-site overlap. And I signed it first because leaders should sign the rules they expect, others to carry. A hospital network sent a renewal that cited our kit by name as a requirement for all vendors. And I framed the clause not as a trophy, but as a marker that the market now rewards steadiness. That night, I followed my ritual. 3 lines on the pad. Reconcile license ledger against acknowledgements. Proof 2 junior memos for timeline accuracy. Write 1 quiet thank you to a site supervisor who moved a tense chat to better light. And I slept with the same even breath I carried into the hearing, because dignity, once restored, needs maintenance more than defense, and maintenance lives on paper that is read and followed. I kept the circle tight and the ledgers clean because clean circles make rooms quiet. So I ran a mid-year audit on everything we had promised and measured it against what had actually happened. License payments matched the term sheet, policy training. Signatures matched the roster. Continuity affidavits matched the procurement logs that showed who contacted whom first, and every mismatch column read 0, which felt like a kind of music. A rumor surfaced that I had leaned on a superintendent during a renewal, and I answered it with the package I always prepare. The affidavit that records buyer initiation, the email headers that show first contact, the firewall note that limits scope to advisory, and the signed page from their own handoff plan, and the person who had carried the rumor left it alone because paper leaves no room for performance. Jennifer and I added 2 small lines to our kit: a cooling clock that forces 20 minutes of quiet before any public post about a staff change, and a clause that diverts a portion of fees to training if a vendor breaks the handoff rule and causes preventable churn. And buyers accepted both because they prefer penalties that build skill over punishments that only sting. I visited the old atrium for a chamber award evening and stood under the founder's memo about selling to the person while a new plaque about handoffs hung beside it, and I felt no heat, only the even weight of work that had found its shelf. And I drove home, thinking about how a line on a wall can turn a culture by a few degrees if people keep pointing to it and signing under it. A city project called for nocturnal support, and I agreed to stand by in a trailer from midnight to dawn while crews staged a delivery, and I watched a young rep hold his 4D card in his palm and move a tense exchange toward better light and a camera without raising his voice, and afterward his 3-line report landed in my inbox with time, origin, and next step, and I pinned it to our board as a model. The regulator sent a final note that the churn normalization had been addressed with internal controls and training, and I filed it behind the settlement and closed that tab in my mind for good. My interns finished. A capstone run where they simulated the worst week of a renewal season. They logged contact origin, documented handoffs with named overlap, and wrote briefs that could ride straight into a hearing without edits. And I realized they no longer needed me in the room to keep the tone even, which is the test that matters. I updated our handbook with one more promise that no one in our shop would let a badge change color without a signed plan and a face in the room, and I signed it again because rules carry more weight when the person at the top carries them first. A buyer asked if we could certify vendors on the kit, and we built a small badge that requires proof of 3 clean handoffs and a short exam on timelines and names. And the first set of firms passed and posted the badge on their sites, and I smiled because calm had become marketable without becoming loud. The last task of the week was small but important. I reconciled the ledger, sent one thank you to a site supervisor who moved a hard talk off a slab and into the trailer where cameras and witnesses live, and I wrote my 3 lines for tomorrow. Check 1 vendor badge submission, review 1 junior memo for precision on headers, send 1 quiet note to Omar with the archive index he built printed and bound. Then I set down the pen and let the office sit in its earned quiet, the kind that follows seasons when a person refuses to perform and chooses to record until the room itself learns to breathe. I began the next week with a quiet check of our badge program and saw 3 vendors submit proof of clean handoffs with on-site overlap. So I verified signatures, compared dates to procurement logs, and issued certificates that carry no hype, only a record. A hospital network sent a short renewal that wrote our kit into vendor requirements, and I printed the clause and pinned it to the board because that is how change becomes normal. The license schedule ticked forward. I reconciled the payment against the ledger and the term sheet, then closed the bank tab and moved to a junior memo where I cut adjectives until only times, names, and next steps remained. And the memo felt ready for any hearing, even though I hoped it would never need one. A small forum resurfaced an old still, and the platform removed it with an automated note that referenced the correction, and I filed the notice without a spike of feeling, since a working system is the point. Omar dropped by with a bound archive index, and I thanked him for building a trail that lets people sleep. And I set the index into the cabinet beside the settlement and the policy page because those 3 documents form a spine. At dusk, I wrote my 3 lines: certify 1 vendor, review 1, risk brief, send 1 thank you. And then I stood in the doorway and looked at the board where old pain had become rules and habits, and I felt the even weight that tells me a name is sitting where it should, carried by paper and steady work. I closed out the quarter by running my ledger against the wall calendar and found every promise matched a document, which let me turn to quieter tasks that keep the center steady. So I refreshed the handbook with a single line that requires a written thank you to any departing person alongside the handoff plan because respect is also a control. Then I met with a new cohort and watched them practice a mock walkout where they recorded times, witnesses, and overlap before any badge changed color. And they wrote 3-line briefs that would stand even if no one liked them, which is the right test. A regional buyer asked for a pre-renewal check, and I used the kit to find one weak link in their staffing ladder, then wrote a week-by-week cover. Plan they signed without debate, and I logged the signature time next to the contact origin because tidy books make rumor pointless. The final license installment for the year landed with the correct memo, and I reconciled it, filed the receipt, and set a reminder for the next schedule. Then I sent a short note to the other side asking for confirmation that their training page remained live and current, which arrived within the hour. A trade bulletin published my piece on graceful exits, and I saved the PDF without reading comments, since outcomes are the reward. At dusk, I wrote 3 lines, verify 2 vendor badges, proof 1 junior memo for headers and times, send 1 quiet thanks to a superintendent who moved a tense chat to better light. Then I locked the cabinet where the settlement, policy page, and archive index sit like a spine. And I felt the same even weight that carried me out of the atrium, a name held by paper, by ritual, and by the work I keep finishing. I opened the week with a small audit of our own promises, checked license reminders against the ledger, verified 2 vendor badges with clean overlap, and trimmed a junior memo until it read like a path of times and names. I mailed a quiet thank you to a buyer who insisted on a handoff plan before a team change, because gratitude keeps gears from grinding. A forum tried an old still again, and the platform removed it with the usual notice, which I filed without heat. At dusk, I wrote 3 lines, confirm 1 roster, review 1 brief, send 1 thanks, then I locked the cabinet and felt the even weight of a name carried by work. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.